Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
We're really excited to bring you the second episode in our CMPA miniseries. This is a tough and heavy topic and is all about how to deal with complaints from the college or an actual lawsuit. Richard Mimeault and Liisa Honey join us to talk about what to expect and how to navigate this really difficult process. They also talk about the psychological impacts that going through this process can have for physicians and maybe some resources that people can access when they're going through such a tough and difficult time. Be sure to also check out the CMPA's module on their website. That's also called The Anatomy of a Lawsuit. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. Once again, we're delighted to have our second episode in this miniseries with the CMPA. We're even more delighted this time to be joined by Dr. Liisa Honey and, of course, our returning guest, Dr. Rich Mimeault. We'll just take this opportunity to ask Dr. Honey to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background and how you got involved in the CMPA.
My background is obstetrics and gynecology. I came through University of Ottawa many years ago and spent 20 years in a community hospital here in Ottawa, chief of the department, medical director of the department, and really focusing in on quality improvement and quality assurance. Did a little bit of work with the Telfer School of Business and piqued my interest in trying to further that agenda. I joined the CMPA in 2018 after doing a project with them, really focusing in on risk management and obstetrics, and felt that that was my calling to try to look at these issues from a systems level. Now, working with the learning group at CMPA, we're really trying to focus in on how we can help and support CMPA members not only avoid medical legal complaints, but improve their practice, improve patient safety. And there's lots of data showing that improving patient safety helps reduce medical legal issues.
So as we sort of talked about at the top of the show before we started recording, the intent of this episode is to give our listeners sort of the nuts and bolts of dealing with a legal complaint or the legal process, and perhaps how the CMPA can help us navigate that situation. I'd invite listeners to listen to the first episode on this miniseries, where we talked about the fact that it's fairly common that folks will have to deal with a complaint at some point in their career. So maybe I'll start us off by asking Richard, if you get this letter saying that a patient has filed a complaint, what does that initial stages usually look like? Is it usually that you'll get a letter from the college or from the CMPA or directly from a patient? How do most people actually find out that there's been a complaint lodged against them?
So complaints and lawsuits are a little bit different. I would say that in some circumstances, you might even be expecting one. Sometimes an unhappy patient actually tells you that they're going to do this. But in both the cases of a college complaint and a legal complaint, you find out by means of a letter. Now, the letters are a little bit different. In a college complaint, it comes in this envelope from the college marked confidential on the front. So that usually raises the hair on the back of your neck immediately. With a legal complaint, what you get is a hand-delivered letter, typically from a court-appointed bailiff or some sort of process server. Now, the language used, particularly in the statement of claim, which is what you get with a lawsuit, the language used in a statement of claim is, I'm going to say, a very potent vagal stimulant. If anything's going to dry up your salivary glands quickly, it's you open this up and you start to read it. Very liberal use of the words like negligent and reckless and, failure, that kind of stuff. So both of them, but particularly the statement of claim, I'll say, are very panic-inducing. And I think panic is the right word. And I think when we're in that state, that kind of emotional state, there is the potential for doing some things that we shouldn't do. And, maybe we can talk about those things that we shouldn't do later. But honestly, I think that the first step there is to stop, and hopefully all of our listeners will have had the chance to listen to the whole podcast and realize that, yes, I can stop for a second and call the CMPA. I think that is absolutely the first step to take. Pick up the phone, call the CMPA. There will be guidance for every step of the way to make sure that you are doing the things you should be doing. And also, very importantly, not doing the things that you shouldn't do.
Yeah, I can just imagine that gut-wrenching feeling that must occur when you see that letter coming towards you. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Honey. Obviously, this is going to differ from case to case, and again, I'll put the disclaimer that this is not meant to be specific advice about a specific situation, but general advice about how to navigate the situation. So besides kind of taking a minute and calming yourself down, calling the CMPA, is there anyone else, Dr. Honey, that we should be reaching out to if we're in that situation? And some of the specific things that you think might be helpful, like is it helpful at that point to start going through old notes, looking up the chart? What are some of the next steps that folks should be thinking about doing if they're ever in that situation?
Thanks for the question, Amir. The important thing is, as Richard said, take a moment, stop, breathe, call the CMPA. And the CMPA is really going to guide you from that point on. The temptation is going to be to either reach out to the chart or reach out to the patient. And I would strongly advise against reaching out to the patient. Sometimes it just feels like a personal affront and a misunderstanding that you might be able to sort out by speaking to the patient. But really, that is not the best approach. Listen to the advice you get from CMPA. As far as going through the charts and the notes, it is really important that you understand who has custodian of that chart. If you are the custodian of that chart in your own private office, then going through the note would be fine. Make sure that you don't alter the note. There's the tendency to pick up a pen or type in some additional information, keeping in mind that EMRs have ways of tracking when those notes were made, and it in a court of law that looks subversive, and it is absolutely frowned upon to alter the note after the fact. You can always add an addendum with today's date. But again, your best bet is take the advice that you get from the physician advisor or lawyer at the CMPA. Hospital charts are not within your purview to access without consent. You're not the custodian of the hospital chart. So please be wary about the reflex to access the hospital chart when you get a complaint or a statement of claim. It is a very devastating time, and it can be very, very upsetting. But please don't speak to your colleagues about the details of the case. You can talk to your colleagues about feeling overwhelmed or feeling down or depressed, but please avoid speaking to your colleagues about the details of the case, because that information can then be discoverable in a court of law. So it is best to avoid that reflex. The other thing, and this is pretty obvious, but making any public statements on social media, even if you feel that this is a frivolous case, really you want to avoid any kind of mention on social media. I think that's about it. The physician advisor at CMPA will refer you on to a lawyer who is going to be with you for the duration of this case, and they're gonna get to know you well. They're gonna get to understand what's upsetting you, and they will be your support and your confidant through this case. So that relationship that you form with legal counsel is a real critical one during this process.
I'm curious for any of you, there's quite a difference between a complaint that comes in through the college versus being served with an indication that it'll be a lawsuit in terms of process and pathway from that point. And I was wondering if you could walk us through each of those two scenarios, each of those two paths, and how they're so different.
Sure. I maybe take a step back first, Chad. That's a good question. I mean, they are different. And I think we mentioned it in the previous podcast, which was, we tend to look at the legal one as being much more impactful and much more scary. But the reality is with the lawsuit, you can continue to work. If there's a decision that's made in favor of the patient and compensation is due, well, the CMPA will pay that compensation for you, but you're still a surgeon. You can still do your work. College complaints, the college actually controls our license, and the college has the ability to limit our activity. And so I guess the first thing would be to say that never treat a college complaint as less than a legal complaint. They are just as important, possibly more important, again, because it has that potential impact on your ability to practice. With the legal, what will happen is you'll get the statement of claim, you'll call the CMPA, the CMPA will put you in the hands of a lawyer, and that process will then start. Now, if you look at the CMPA's experience with medical legal files, the reality is that it's only a really small percentage of cases that actually go to trial. I think it's somewhere in the vicinity of about 10%. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But there's a pretty good chance that at some point you'll have to go through this process that we call discovery. So discovery is a process where under oath, you get to share your story, but you're sharing your story and being interviewed or interrogated, if you wish, by the lawyers as well. And again, as Liisa mentioned, this is the part where the CMPA lawyer works with you ahead of time, coaches you through the whole process. And the coaching is really around being honest, just answering the questions that are being posed, and not offering extraneous details, being professional, avoiding a lot of medical jargon, and really trying to stay as calm as possible. The lawyers are really good at just coaching you through that whole process. Now, as I said, you might make it to discovery. A very small percentage of cases actually make it to a trial. Some cases will get settled. So if the expert opinions on the file are such that, there was negligence, this was preventable harm, then the CMPA will settle the file. They'll settle with the patient. And just to give you an example, over the last 10 years, the CMPA, on behalf of us, the members of CMPA, has paid almost $2.5 billion in patient compensation. So a lot of settlement, and one there's a need to settle, that we try and do it fairly quickly. The other cases, some of them will be dismissed for a whole bunch of reasons. Some get resolved at the level of mediation or pretrial conferences, but most do not end up. So most of the time, you don't end up having to go to court. In terms of the college complaints, you'll get that letter. There will be a college advisor. And typically what they'll do is they'll get permission for you to review the chart, the documentation, if it's not your own chart. They'll get that permission from the patient. You then review the chart. You describe your side of the story. And there will always be an attempt on the college's part to mediate this and to try and find a settlement. And again, in a small percentage of cases, if it's clear that the college's interpretation, sometimes with the input of peers, feels that there are issues that need to be dealt with, well, that might then go on to disciplines, or you might have a recommendation to do something in your work environment, in your practice, to improve specific aspects. Anything that I should have mentioned that I didn't, Liisa?
No, I think you covered it.
Liisa, how long does this process usually take? Like if you were actually get involved in a true lawsuit or a trial, how long does this whole process typically take?
It can take years. And as Richard mentioned, the important thing is you have this relationship with your legal counsel. They are going to do their work in the background, and you go back to doing your work. And even if this ends in a settlement for the patient, and hopefully that is resolved quickly, it's not going to affect your ability to keep working. If it does need to go to trial, as Richard said, 10% of cases will, it can be years. So you need to mentally put it on the back burner and let the lawyers do their thing. They'll keep you informed as to what's going on. But you just go back to doing what you do best, and that's providing clinical care.
Having had the displeasure of the experience, it is a lingering stress, though. It's the little letters that come back to remind you. It's the length of the process is onerous in terms of the stress it imposes on you.
Yeah, and I do want to touch upon that, the psychological aspects of handling that, and get both of your advice about that side of things, because I can only imagine how much this sort of adds an extra weight on your brain and your soul. I'll just also mention that the CMPA is a really excellent module online that goes through all of this, the whole process. And we'll put a link to that in our show notes, because I think it's really, having looked through it myself, I think it's really, really useful outline of that whole process and what to expect. And I think whether you're going through that process or potentially just for your own knowledge, I think that module online from the CMPA is excellent. I will ask, just because I think these questions sort of commonly come up, can you just tell us what does discovery mean? We often hear that term, but it's not always clear what that means.
Discovery is basically the process of getting each party's details of what happened and giving the opportunity of lawyers from both sides to ask questions. You'll meet with your lawyer and the patient's lawyer, and you get a chance to say, well, this, from my perspective, this is what's happened and this is why. And as I mentioned, that, you get questioned, but there's a whole coaching process with your lawyer ahead of time to make sure you're answering what is being asked of you, and not going down, potentially risky rabbit holes, that sort of thing. You could almost think of it as a mini trial, I suppose, but it's basically, there's no judgment happening there. It's basically sharing the information that is going to be used potentially when you go to trial, if you go to trial.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. Liisa, maybe I'll ask you next. So what percentage of cases, generally speaking, that go to trial are successful in terms of, the trial against the physician sort of being in favor of the patient? And then the second piece of that is that what are the range of implications typically if you've been found, quote unquote, guilty in a lawsuit? And what sort of impact does that have on your practice and your life?
In terms of percentages of cases, so we said that only about 10% are actually going to go to trial. Probably about 60% of those will get settled or dropped somewhere along the way. And again, if a payout is needed, it's important that that people understand that payout is not coming out of your pocket. You don't need to be putting your money into your spouse's accounts to hide it. It is CMPA that pays out the damages. Richard, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's important to point out is that while it's true that when we end up going to trial, the small percentage is also a reflection of the fact that in those cases, we have very strong support from peer experts that say, no, the care here was good care. What happened is inherent risk. It would have happened to any of us. I mention that because in the popular press, often we hear about, how, the CMPA, it's unfair. But they win all these cases. But I think it's a reflection of the fact that they are the cases that we have really good support from our peers to say, yes, the case and the care in this case was good care.
That totally makes sense. I know you said that often the lawyers will coach you in terms of how to handle being in the trial or on trial. But is there general advice that, if you were to go to trial, about how to conduct yourself or to handle that situation? Maybe at least I can start with you. Are there general principles or sort of tips that the lawyers will talk folks through if they're in that situation?
The important thing is that you are professional and honest. Again, your lawyers will coach you in terms of not being emotional and not being angry. You want to come across as empathetic, having done your best care.
I'm curious in the sense that, you've outlined the process so well, but do you have any specific advice in the unusual scenario that perhaps a colleague has generated a college complaint or even potentially a lawsuit against yourself in terms of, how to behave, how to keep that quiet as you maybe work along every day, how to sort of interact with the psychology and the environmental pressures that might come with that scenario?
That's a really tough situation to be in. It's and difficult to not want to talk to that particular colleague. But again, if a complaint has been lodged or a lawsuit has been filed, you are best to avoid speaking with that person without a lawyer guiding you. This certainly happens. The difficulty for CMPA is that both parties are members. So we do end up representing both sides. And so we have to get different legal counsel clearly for both sides. It is tough waters to navigate because you need to be professional, continue to do your work, try to work professionally with this person that's lodged the complaint. Richard, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
The circumstances that you mentioned, which is, between colleagues, if it's, a colleague lodging a complaint, I think it's even more important to call the CMPA. There's an added level there to call the CMPA because the assistance that the CMPA provides is for assisting you with problems arising from the practice of medicine. Problems between colleagues aren't always related to the practice of medicine. So it'll be really, really important to contact the CMPA and be sure that the CMPA will be there for you in that particular circumstance. And those can vary hugely. So I don't think we'd ever get into the details here, but for sure you should be calling the CMPA.
That actually brings up another point. We've talked a lot about calling the CMPA for a lawsuit, but we would really encourage people to call the CMPA if you get a college complaint. Again, we can help you navigate that letter that needs to go back to the college, and help to ensure that you are addressing the issues at hand and trying to de-escalate that at the level of the college.
Maybe I'll just hammer home one more time, specifically on the practice implications that both of these situations may have. So if we take this situation of a lawsuit, Liisa, what usually happens if it's settled? Does that have any implications on the way that you practice moving forward? And in the case of a college complaint, I think that's more obvious that they may put some restrictions on the way that you practice, et cetera. But maybe you could talk about those two situations, Liisa, in terms of the implications on your practice moving forward.
Thanks, Amir. As you mentioned, a college complaint can definitely put restrictions on your practice, which is why a college complaint needs to be managed and handled very seriously. In terms of lawsuits, if you've had to settle in court, many colleges request that information on your reapplication for privileges. Richard, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to this, but it's not the lawsuits necessarily that are going to affect your ability to practice. It's the college. They determine that based on any complaints that may have come through.
My understanding, Liisa, is that it's true, on our annual renewals, I think in every province, the colleges ask you if you've, had any kind of medical legal activity settled or not. And the college could choose to investigate if they thought it was something very serious. But my understanding is that is actually a fairly rare occurrence, that the college would actually take that information and then start acting on it. So Yes, there is a potential, but I think it is actually a very uncommon thing to happen.
Not to dwell on any particular element of this, but we wanted to return to the psychology of and sort of the stress of dealing with all of this over such a prolonged or protracted period that, as you point out, can be quite common. Do you have any pearls for our listeners in terms of resources they might access or behavior that, you've highlighted nicely the no-go behavior, but what about the other side of it in terms of, an era of physician wellness? This is really in many ways an antithesis to that reality.
Thanks for that question, Chad. And I think that that is a really important component of what we can help with at CMPA. We now have a division of physician support and wellness, and what we do try to do throughout this process is help support the member and support their mental health. And again, there are lots of resources to access. One of the things that we've recently launched is the Validated Physician Wellbeing Index, and it's on our website, and it allows you to evaluate where you are at a particular point in time, and 3 months later to do it again and see if physicians love data, and it's a way for you to see your own wellness, and lots of resources available through that particular tool on the website. The important thing is, do not isolate yourself. You are not alone in having received a college complaint or a lawsuit, and talking to your colleagues, you will probably find that many have been through this. And now, I mentioned not to speak to your colleagues about details of the case, but it is okay to say that you are feeling overwhelmed or lack of confidence as a result of having this complaint or lawsuit. And you would be shocked and amazed at how many of your colleagues have had to go through the same thing and done it in isolation, because we don't normalize talking about things like this. But the more that we do, and the more that we support each other through this, the better off we're all going to be. So don't isolate yourself. Make sure that you are spending time with your family. I mean, all the things like sleeping, eating well, exercising, looking after yourself are very important. But reaching out to people to talk to. And the physician advisor at CMPA that manages your case will be a contact for you. Your legal team will be a contact for you. And as well, lots of resources that we have available on the website. And the Physician Wellbeing Index is a really interesting tool to help you gauge where you're at.
Do I put a bigger plug in for the CMPA and the lawyers? To be honest, again, having had that lived experience, to me, one of the biggest things was the ability of the lawyer, to hold your hand through this. I found that they were outstanding at, helping you take it down a few notches and reassure you that it literally is a hand-holding process, and it's amazing in terms of helping you get back to normal. But in addition to all of the other resources you mentioned.
Well, thank you all for joining us again for this episode. I know it's early on a Friday morning, so I really appreciate all of you joining us. I'm really looking forward to the other episodes in this miniseries, and I think this has been incredibly valuable. So maybe I'll just ask you to close us out by giving your top 3 tips for navigating a complaint or a lawsuit. Maybe I'll start with Liisa.
So top 3, number 1, call the CMPA. Number 2, do not reflex and go directly to the medical record. Think about that first. Are you the custodian of the medical record? And 3, reach out to your friends, family, confidants, and talk about how you're feeling.
I can't help but echo call the CMPA, and I know that sounds like a self-serving thing since we're from the CMPA, but again, I say it from lived experience. That's perhaps the most important piece.
That is perfect. Thank you again.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.